The Life of Flavius Josephus by Flavius Josephus, translated by William Whiston. The family from which I am derived is not an ignoble one, but hath descended all along from the priests. And as nobility among several people is of a different origin, so with us to be of a sacerdotal dignity is an indication of the splendor of a family. Now, I am not only sprung from a sacerdotal family in general, but from the first of the 24 courses. And, as among us, there is not only a considerable difference between one family of each course and another, I am of the chief family of that first course also, nay, further, by my mother, I am of the royal blood. For the children of Asmoneus, from whom that family was derived, had both the office of the high priesthood and the dignity of a king. For a long time together, I will accordingly set down my progenitors in order. My grandfather's father was named Simon, with the addition of Celis. He lived at the same time with that son of Simon, the high priest, who first of all the high priest was named Hyrcanus. This Simon Celis had 9 sons, one of whom was Matthias, called Eplius. He married the daughter of Jonathan the high priest, which Jonathan was the first of the sons of Asmoneus, who was high priest, and was the brother of Simon the high priest also. This Matthias had a son called Matthias Curtis, and that in the first year of the government of Hyrcanus, his son's name was Joseph, born in the 9th year of the reign of Alexandra. His son Matthias was born in the 10th year of the reign of Archelaus, as was I born to Matthias in the first year of the reign of Caius Caesar. I have 3 sons. Hyrcanus, the eldest, was born in the 4th year of the reign of Vespasian, as was Justus born in the 7th, and Agrippa in the 9th. Thus have I set down the genealogy of my family, as I have found it described in the public records, and so bid adieu to those who calumniate me, as of a lower original. Now my father Matthias was not only eminent on account of his nobility, but had a higher commendation on account of his righteousness, and was in great reputation in Jerusalem, the greatest city we have. I was myself brought up with my brother, whose name was Matthias, for he was my own brother by both father and mother, and I made mighty proficiency in the improvements of my learning, and appeared to have both a great memory and understanding. Moreover, when I was a child, and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had to learning, on which account the high priests and principal men of the city came then frequently to me together, in order to know my opinion about the accurate understanding of points of the law. And when I was about 16 years old, I had a mind to make trim of the several sects that were among us. These sects are 3. The first is that of the Pharisee, the second that Sadducees, and the third that of the Essenes, as we have frequently told you. For I thought that by this means I might choose the best, if I were once acquainted with them all. So I contented myself with hard fare, and underwent great difficulties, and went through them all. Nor did I content myself with these trials only, but when I was informed that one, whose name was Bannus, lived in the desert, and used no other clothing than grew upon trees, and had no other food than what grew of its own accord, and bathed himself in cold water frequently, both by night and by day, in order to preserve his chastity, I imitated him in those things, and continued with him 3 years. So, when I had accomplished my desires, I returned back to the city, being now 19 years old, and began to conduct myself according to the rules of the sect of the Pharisees, which is of kin to the sect of the Stoics, as the Greeks call them. But when I was in the 26th year of my age, it happened that I took a voyage to Rome, and this on the occasion which I shall now describe. At the time when Felix was procurator of Judea, there were certain priests of my acquaintance, and very excellent persons they were, whom on a small and trifling occasion he had put into bonds, and sent to Rome to plead their cause before Caesar. These I was desirous to procure deliverance for, and that especially because I was informed that they were not unmindful of piety towards God, even under their afflictions, but supported themselves with figs and nuts. Accordingly, I came to Rome, though it were through a great number of hazards by sea, for as our ship was drowned in the Adriatic Sea, we that were in it, being about 600 in number, swam for our lives all the night, when, upon the first appearance of the day, and upon our sight of a ship of Cyrene, I and some others, 80 in all, by God's providence, prevented the rest, and were taken up into the other ship. And when I had thus escaped, and was come to Diurkia, which the Italians call Puteoli, I became acquainted with Aliturius, an actor of plays, and much beloved by Nero, but a Jew by birth, and through his interest became known to Poppaea, Caesar's wife, and took care, as soon as possible, to entreat her to procure that the priests might be set at liberty. And when, besides this favour, I had obtained many presents from Poppaea, I returned home again, and now I perceived innovations were already begun, and that there were a great many very much elevated in hopes of a revolt from the Romans. I therefore endeavoured to put a stop to these tumultuous persons, and persuaded them to change their minds, and laid before their eyes against whom it was that they were going to fight, and told them that they were inferior to the Romans not only in martial skill, but also in good fortune, and desired them not rashly, and after the most foolish manner, to bring on the dangers of the most terrible mischiefs upon their country, upon their families, and upon themselves. And this I said with vehement exhortation, because I foresaw that the end of such a war would be most unfortunate to us. But I could not persuade them, for the madness of desperate men was quite too hard for me. I was then afraid lest, by inculcating these things so often, I should incur their hatred and their suspicions, as if I were of our enemy's party, and should run into the danger of being seized by them and slain, since they were already possessed of Antonia, which was the citadel. So I retired into the inner court of the temple. Yet did I go out of the temple again, after Manahem and the principal of the band of robbers were put to death, when I abode among the high priests and the chief of the Pharisees. But no small fear seized upon us when we saw the people in arms, while we ourselves knew not what we should do, and were not able to restrain the seditious. However, as the danger was directly upon us, we pretended that we were of the same opinion with them, but only advised them to be quiet for the present, and to let the enemy go away, still hoping that Gessius Florus would not be long ere he came, and that with great forces, and so put an end to these seditious proceedings. But upon his coming and fighting, he was beaten, and a great many of those that were with him fell, and this disgrace, which Gessius with Cestius received, became the calamity of our whole nation. For those that were fond of the war were so far elevated with this success, that they had hopes of finally conquering the Romans, of which war another occasion was ministered, which was this: those that dwelt in the neighboring cities of Syria seized upon such Jews as dwelt among them, with their wives and children, and slew them, when they had not the least occasion of complaint against them. For they did neither attempt any innovation or revolt from the Romans, nor had they given any marks of hatred or treacherous designs towards the Syrians. But what was done by the inhabitants of Scythopolis was the most impious and most highly criminal of all. For when the Jews, their enemies, came upon them from without, they forced the Jews that were among them to bear arms against their own countrymen, which it is unlawful for us to do. And when, by their assistance, they had joined battle with those who attacked them, and had beaten them, after that victory, they forgot the assurances they had given these their fellow citizens and confederates, and slew them all, being in number many 10,000s. The like miseries were undergone by those Jews that were the inhabitants of Damascus. But we have given a more accurate account of these things in the books of the Jewish war. I only mention them now because I would demonstrate to my readers that the Jews' war with the Romans was not voluntary, but that, for the main, they were forced by necessity to enter into it. So when Gessius had been beaten, as we have said already, the principal men of Jerusalem, seeing that the robbers and innovators had arms in great plenty, and fearing lest they, while they were unprovided of arms, should be in subjection to their enemies, which also came to be the case afterward, and, being informed that all Galilee had not yet revolted from the Romans, but that some part of it was still quiet, they sent me, and 2 others of the priests, who were men of excellent characters, Jozzar and Judas, in order to persuade the ill men there to lay down their arms, and to teach them this lesson, that it were better to have those arms reserved for the most courageous men that the nation had, than to be kept there, for that it had been resolved that those our best men should always have their arms ready against futurity, but still so, that they should wait to see what the Romans would do. When I had therefore received these instructions, I came into Galilee, and found the people of Sepphoris in no small agony about their country, by reason that the Galileans had resolved to plunder it, on account of the friendship they had with the Romans, and because they had given their right hand, and made a league with Cestius Gallus, the president of Syria. But I delivered them all out of the fear they were in, and persuaded the multitude to deal kindly with them, and permitted them to send to those that were their own hostages, with Gessius to Dora, which is a city of Phoenicia, as often as they pleased, though I still found the inhabitants of Tiberias ready to take arms, and that on the occasion following. There were 3 factions in this city. The first was composed of men of worth and gravity. Of these, Julius Capellus was the head. Now he, as well as all his companions, Herod the son of Maerus, and Herod the son of Gamalius, and Compsus the son of Compsus. For as to Compsus's brother, Crispus, who had once been governor of the city under the great King Agrippa, he was beyond Jordan in his own possessions. All these persons before named gave their advice that the city should then continue in their allegiance to the Romans and to the king. But Pistus, who was guided by his son Justus, did not acquiesce in that resolution. Otherwise he was himself naturally of a good and virtuous character. But the second faction was composed of the most ignoble persons, and was determined for war. But as for Justus, the son of Pistus, who was the head of the third faction, although he pretended to be doubtful about going to war, yet was he really desirous of innovation, as supposing that he should gain power to himself by the change of affairs. He therefore came to the midst of them, and endeavored to inform the multitude that the city Tiberias had ever been a city of Galilee, and that in the days of Herod, the Tetrarch, who had built it, it had obtained the principal place, and that he had ordered that the city Sepphoris should be subordinate to the city Tiberias, that they had not lost this preeminence even under Agrippa the father, but had retained it until Felix was procurator of Judea. But he told them that now they had been so unfortunate as to be made a present by Nero to Agrippa Junior, and that, upon Sepphoris's submission of itself to the Romans, that was become the capital city of Galilee, and that the royal library and the archives were now removed from them. When he had spoken these things, and a great many more, against King Agrippa, in order to provoke the people to a revolt, he added that this was the time for them to take arms, and join with the Galileans as their confederates whom they might command, and who would now willingly assist them, out of the hatred they bear to the people of Sepphoris, because they preserved their fidelity to the Romans, and to gather a great number of forces, in order to punish. And as he said this, he exhorted the multitude to go to war, for his abilities lay in making harangues to the people, and in being too hard in his speeches for such as opposed him, though they advised what was more to their advantage, and this by his craftiness and his fallacies, for he was not unskilful in the learning of the Greeks, and in dependence on that skill it was that he undertook to write a history of these affairs, as aiming, by this way of haranguing, to disguise the truth. But as to this man, and how ill were his character and conduct of life, and how he and his brother were, in great measure, the authors of our destruction, I shall give the reader an account in the progress of my narration. So when Justus had, by his persuasions, prevailed with the citizens of Tiberias to take arms, nay, and had forced a great many so to do against their wills, he went out, and set the villages that belonged to Gadara and Hippos on fire, which villages were situated on the borders of Tiberias, and of the region of Scythopolis. And this was the state Tiberias was now in. But as for Gischala, its affairs were thus: when John the son of Levi saw some of the citizens much elevated upon their revolt from the Romans, he labored to restrain them, and entreated them that they would keep their allegiance to them. But he could not gain his purpose, although he did his endeavors to the utmost, for the neighboring people of Gadara, Gabara, and Sogana, with the Tyrians, got together a great army, and fell upon Gischala, and took Gischala by force, and set it on fire. And when they had entirely demolished it, they returned home. Upon which John was so enraged that he armed all his men, and joined battle with the people forementioned, and rebuilt Gischala after a manner better than before, and fortified it with walls for its future security. But Gamala persevered in its allegiance to the Romans, for the reason following: Philip, the son of Jasimus, who was their governor under King Agrippa, had been unexpectedly preserved when the royal palace at Jerusalem had been besieged, but as he fled away, had fallen into another danger, and that was of being killed by Manahem and the robbers that were with him. But certain Babylonians, who were of his kindred, and were then in Jerusalem, hindered the robbers from executing their design. So Philip stayed there 4 days, and fled away on the 5th, having disguised himself with fictitious hair, that he might not be discovered. And when he was come to one of the villages to him belonging, but one that was situated at the borders of the citadel of Gamala, he sent to some of those that were under him, and commanded them to come to him. But God himself hindered that his intention, and this for his own advantage also. For had it not so happened, he had certainly perished. For a fever having seized upon him immediately, he wrote to Agrippa and Bernice, and gave them to one of his freedmen to carry them to Varus, who at this time was procurator of the kingdom, which the king and his sister had entrusted him with all, while they were gone to Berytus with an intention of meeting Gessius. When Varus had received these letters of Philip, and had learned that he was preserved, he was very uneasy at it, as supposing that he should appear useless to the king and his sister. Now Philip was come. He therefore produced the carrier of the letters before the multitude, and accused him of forging the same, and said that he spake falsely when he related that Philip was at Jerusalem, fighting among the Jews against the Romans. So he slew him. And when this freedman of Philip did not return again, Philip was doubtful what should be the occasion of his stay, and sent a second messenger with letters, that he might, upon his return, inform him what had befallen the other that had been sent before, and why he tarried so long. Varus accused this messenger also, when he came, of telling a falsehood, and slew him, for he was puffed up by the Syrians that were at Caesarea, and had great expectations, for they said that Agrippa would be slain by the Romans for the crimes which the Jews had committed, and that he should himself take the government, as derived from their kings. For Varus was, by the confession of all, of the royal family, as being a descendant of Sohemus, who had enjoyed a tetrarchy about Libanus, for which reason it was that he was puffed up, and kept the letters to himself. He contrived also that the king should not meet with those writings, by guarding all the passes, lest anyone should escape, and informed the king what had been done. He, moreover, slew many of the Jews, in order to gratify the Syrians of Caesarea. He had a mind also to join with the Trachonites in Batanea, and to take up arms and make an assault upon the Babylonian Jews that were at Ecbatana, for that was the name they went by. He therefore called to him 12 of the Jews of Caesarea, of the best character, and ordered them to go to Ecbatana, and inform their countrymen who dwelt there, that Varus hath heard that you intend to march against the king. But, not believing that report, he hath sent us to persuade you to lay down your arms, and that this compliance will be a sign that he did well not to give credit to those that raised the report concerning you. He also enjoined them to send 70 of their principal men to make a defense for them as to the accusation laid against them. So when the 12 messengers came to their countrymen at Ecbatana, and found that they had no designs of innovation at all, they persuaded them to send the 70 men also, who, not at all suspecting what would come, sent them accordingly. So these 70 went down to Caesarea, together with the 12 ambassadors, where Varus met them with the king's forces, and slew them all, together with the 12 ambassadors, and made an expedition against the Jews of Ecbatana. But one there was of the 70 who escaped, and made haste to inform the Jews of their coming. Upon which they took their arms, with their wives and children, and retired to the citadel at Gamala, leaving their own villages full of all sorts of good things, and having many 10,000s of cattle therein. When Philip was informed of these things, he also came to the citadel of Gamala. And when he was come, the multitude cried aloud, and desired him to resume the government, and to make an expedition against Varus and the Syrians of Caesarea. For it was reported that they had slain the king. But Philip restrained their zeal, and put them in mind of the benefits the king had bestowed upon them, and told them how powerful the Romans were, and said it was not for their advantage to make war with them. And at length he prevailed with them. But now, when the king was acquainted with Varus's design, which was to cut off the Jews of Caesarea, being many 10,000s, with their wives and children, and all in one day, he called to him Equiculus Modius, and sent him to be Varus's successor, as we have elsewhere related. But still Philip kept possession of the citadel of Gamala, and of the country adjoining to it. which thereby continued in their allegiance to the Romans. Now, as soon as I was come into Galilee, and had learned this state of things by the information of such as told me of them, I wrote to the Sanhedrim at Jerusalem about them, and required their direction what I should do. Their direction was that I should continue there, and that, if my fellow legates were willing, I should join with them in the care of Galilee. But those my fellow legates, having gotten great riches from those tithes, which as priests were their dues, and were given to them, determined to return to their own country. Yet when I desired them to stay so long, that we might first settle the public affairs, they complied with me. So I removed, together with them, from the city of Sepphoris, and came to a certain village called Bethmos, 4 furlongs distant from Tiberias, and thence I sent messengers to the Senate of Tiberias, and desired that the principal men of the city would come to me. And when they were come, Justus himself being also with them, I told them that I was sent to them by the people of Jerusalem as a legate, together with these other priests, in order to persuade them to demolish that house which Herod the Tetrarch had built there, and which had the figures of living creatures in it, although our laws have forbidden us to make any such figures, and I desired that they would give us leave so to do immediately. But for a good while Capellus and the principal men belonging to the city would not give us leave, but were at length entirely overcome by us, and were induced to be of our opinion. So Jesus, the son of Saphias, one of those whom we have already mentioned, as the leader of a seditious tumult of mariners and poor people, prevented us, and took with him certain Galileans, and set the entire palace on fire, and thought he should get a great deal of money thereby, because he saw some of the roofs gilt with gold. They also plundered a great deal of the furniture, which was done without our approbation. For after we had discoursed with Capellus and the principal men of the city, we departed from Bethmos, and went into the upper Galilee. But Jesus and his party slew all the Greeks that were inhabitants of Tiberias, and as many others as were their enemies before the war began. When I understood this state of things, I was greatly provoked, and went down to Tiberias, and took all the care I could of the royal furniture, to recover all that could be recovered from such as had plundered it. They consisted of candlesticks made of Corinthian brass, and of royal tables, and of a great quantity of uncoined silver, and I resolved to preserve whatsoever came to my hand for the king. So I sent for 10 of the principal men of the Senate, and for Capellus, the son of Antyllus, and committed the furniture to them, with this charge, that they should part with it to nobody else but to myself. From thence I and my fellow legates went to Gischala, to John, as desirous to know his intentions, and soon saw that he was for innovations, and had a mind to the principality. For he desired me to give him authority to carry off that corn which belonged to Caesar, and lay in the villages of Upper Galilee. And he pretended that he would expend what it came to in building the walls of his own city. But when I perceived what he endeavored at, and what he had in his mind, I said I would not permit him so to do. For that I thought either to keep it for the Romans, or for myself. Now I was entrusted with the public affairs there by the people of Jerusalem. But when he was not able to prevail with me, he betook himself to my fellow legates, for they had no sagacity in providing for futurity, and were very ready to take bribes. So he corrupted them with money to decree that all that corn which was within his province should be delivered to him, while I, who was but one, was outvoted by 2, and held my tongue. Then did John introduce another cunning contrivance of his, for he said that those Jews who inhabited Caesarea Philippi, and were shut up by the order of the king's deputy there, had sent to him to desire him that, since they had no oil that was pure for their use, he would provide a sufficient quantity of such oil for them, lest they should be forced to make use of oil that came from the Greeks, and thereby transgress their own laws. Now this was said by John, not out of his regard to religion, but out of most flagrant desire of gain. For he knew that 2 sextries were sold with them of Caesarea for 1 drachma, but that at Gischala 80 sextaxes were sold for 4 sextaries. So he gave order that all the oil which was there should be carried away, as having my permission for so doing, which yet I did not grant him voluntarily, but only out of fear of the multitude, since, if I had forbidden him, I should have been stoned by them. When I had therefore permitted this to be done by John, he gained vast sums of money by this his knavery. But when I had dismissed my fellow legates, and sent them back to Jerusalem, I took care to have arms provided, and the cities fortified. And when I had sent for the most hardy among the robbers, I saw that it was not in my power to take their arms from them. But I persuaded the multitude to allow them money as pay, and told them it was better for them to give them a little willingly, rather than to be forced to overlook them, when they plundered their goods from them. And when I had obliged them to take an oath not to come into that country, unless they were invited to come, or else when they had not their pay given them, I dismissed them, and charged them neither to make an expedition against the Romans, nor against those their neighbors that lay round about them. For my first care was to keep Galilee in peace. So I was willing to have the principal of the Galileans, in all 70, as hostages for their fidelity, but still under the notion of friendship. Accordingly, I made them my friends and companions as I journeyed, and set them to judge causes, and with their approbation it was that I gave my sentences, while I endeavored not to mistake what justice required, and to keep my hands clear of all bribery in those determinations. I was now about the 30th year of my age, in which time of life it is a hard thing for anyone to escape the calumnies of the envious, although he restrain himself from fulfilling any unlawful desires, especially where a person is in great authority. Yet did I preserve every woman free from injuries, and as to what presents were offered me, I despised them, as not standing in need of them. Nor indeed would I take those tithes, which were due to me, as a priest, from those that brought them. Yet do I confess that I took part of the spoils of those Syrians which inhabited the cities that adjoined to us, when I had conquered them, and that I sent them to my kindred at Jerusalem. Although, when I twice took Sepphoris by force, and Tiberias 4 times, and Gadara once, and when I had subdued and taken John, who often laid treacherous snares for me, I did not punish with death either him, or any of the people for a name, as the progress of this discourse will show. And on this account, I suppose, it was that God, who is never unacquainted with those that do as they ought to do, delivered me still out of the hands of these my enemies, and afterwards preserved me when I fell into those many dangers which I shall relate hereafter. Now the multitude of the Galileans had that great kindness for me, and fidelity to me, that when their cities were taken by force, and their wives and children carried into slavery, they did not so deeply lament for their own calamities, as they were solicitous for my preservation. But when John saw this, he envied me, and wrote to me, desiring that I would give him leave to come down, and make use of the hot baths of Tiberias for the recovery of the health of his body. Accordingly, I did not hinder him, as having no suspicion of any wicked designs of his, and I wrote to those to whom I had committed the administration of the affairs of Tiberius by name, that they should provide a lodging for John, and for such as should come with him, and should procure him what necessary soever he should stand in need of. Now at this time my abode was in a village of Galilee, which is named Cans. But when John was come to the city of Tiberias, he persuaded the men to revolt from their fidelity to me, and to adhere to him, and many of them gladly received that invitation of his, as ever fond of innovations, and by nature disposed to changes, and delighting in seditions. But they were chiefly Justus and his father Pistus, that were earnest for their revolt from me, and their adherence to John. But I came upon them, and prevented them. For a messenger had come to me from Silas, whom I had made governor of Tiberias, as I have said already, and had told me of the inclinations of the people of Tiberias, and advised me to make haste thither, for that, if I made any delay, the city would come under another's jurisdiction. Upon the receipt of this letter of Silas, I took 200 men along with me, and travelled all night, having sent before a messenger to let the people of Tiberias know that I was coming to them. When I came near to the city, which was early in the morning, the multitude came out to meet me, and John came with them, and saluted me, but in a most disturbed manner, as being afraid that my coming was to call him to an account for what I was now sensible he was doing. So he, in great haste, went to his lodging. But when I was in the open place of the city, having dismissed the guards I had about me excepting one, and 10 armed men that were with him, I attempted to make a speech to the multitude of the people of Tiberias, and, standing on a certain elevated place, I entreated them not to be so hasty in their revolt, for that such a change in their behavior would be to their reproach, and that they would then justly be suspected by those that should be their governors hereafter, as if they were not likely to be faithful to them neither. But before I had spoken all I designed, I heard one of my own domestics bidding me come down, for that it was not a proper time to take care of retaining the goodwill of the people of Tiberias, but to provide for my own safety, and escape my enemies there. For John had chosen the most trusty of those armed men that were about him out of those 1,000 that he had with him, and had given them orders when he sent them to kill me, having learned that I was alone, excepting some of my domestics. So those that were sent came as they were ordered, and they had executed what they came about. Had I not leaped down from the elevation I stood on, and with one of my guards, whose name was James, being carried out of the crowd upon the back of one Herod of Tiberias, and guided by him down to the lake, where I seized a ship, and got into it, and escaped my enemies unexpectedly, and came to Tarichese. Now as soon as the inhabitants of that city understood the perfidiousness of the people of Tiberias, they were greatly provoked at them. So they snatched up their arms, and desired me to be their leader against them, for they said they would avenge their commander's cause upon them. They also carried the report of what had been done to me to all the Galileans, and eagerly endeavored to irritate them against the people of Tiberias, and desired that vast numbers of them would get together, and come to them, that they might act in concert with their commander, what should be determined as fit to be done. Accordingly, the Galileans came to me in great numbers from all parts, with their weapons, and besought me to assault Tiberias, to take it by force, and to demolish it, till it lay even with the ground, and then to make slaves of its inhabitants, with their wives and children, those that were Josephus's friends also, and had escaped out of Tiberias, gave him the same advice, but I did not comply with them, thinking it a terrible thing to begin a civil war among them. For I thought that this contention ought not to proceed further than words. Nay, I told them that it was not for their own advantage to do what they would have me to do, while the Romans expected no other than that we should destroy one another by our mutual seditions. And by saying this, I put a stop to the anger of the Galileans. But now John was afraid for himself, since his treachery had proved unsuccessful. So he took the armed men that were about him, and removed from Tiberias to Gischala, and wrote to me to apologize for himself concerning what had been done, as if it had been done without his approbation, and desired me to have no suspicion of him to his disadvantage. He also added oaths and certain horrible curses upon himself, and supposed he should be thereby believed in the points he wrote about to me. But now another great number of the Galileans came together again with their weapons, as knowing the man, how wicked and how sadly perjured he was, and desired me to lead them against him, and promised me that they would utterly both him and Gischala. Hereupon I professed that I was obliged to them for their readiness to serve me, and that I would more than requite their good will to me. However, I entreated them to restrain themselves, and begged of them to give me leave to do what I intended, which was to put an end to these troubles without bloodshed. And when I had prevailed with the multitude of the Galileans to let me do so, I came to Sepphoris. But the inhabitants of this city, having determined to continue in their allegiance to the Romans, were afraid of my coming to them, and tried, by putting me upon another action, to divert me, that they might be freed from the terror they were in. Accordingly, they sent to Jesus, the captain of those robbers who were in the confines of Ptolemy, and promised to give him a great deal of money, if he would come with those forces he had with him, which were in number 800, and fight with us. Accordingly, he complied with what they desired upon the promises they had made him, and was desirous to fall upon us when we were unprepared for him, and knew nothing of his coming beforehand. So he sent to me, and desired that I would give him leave to come and salute me. When I had given him that leave, which I did without the least knowledge of his treacherous intentions beforehand, he took his band of robbers, and made haste to come to me. Yet did not this his knavery succeed well at last, for as he was already nearly approaching, one of those with him deserted him, and came to me, and told me what he had undertaken to do. When I was informed of this, I went into the marketplace, and pretended to know nothing of his treacherous purpose. I took with me many Galileans that were armed, as also some of those of Tiberias. And when I had given orders that all the roads should be carefully guarded, I charged the keepers of the gates to give admittance to none but Jesus, when he came with the principal of his men, and to exclude the rest, and in case they aimed to force themselves in, to use stripes in order to repel them. Accordingly, those that had received such a charge did as they were bidden, and Jesus came in with a few others. And when I had ordered him to throw down his arms immediately, and told him that if he refused so to do, he was a dead man, he, seeing armed men standing all round about him, was terrified, and complied. And as for those of his followers that were excluded, when they were informed that he was seized, they ran away. I then called Jesus to me by himself, and told him that I was not a stranger to that treacherous design he had against me, nor was I ignorant by whom he was sent for. That, however, I would forgive him what he had done already, if he would repent of it, and be faithful to me hereafter. And thus, upon his promise to do all that I desired, I let him go, and gave him leave to get those whom he had formerly had with him together again. But I threatened the inhabitants of Sepphoris, that, if they would not leave off their ungrateful treatment of me, I would punish them sufficiently. At this time it was that two great men, who were under the jurisdiction of the king, Agrippa, came to me out of the region of Trachonius, bringing their horses and their arms, and carrying with them their money also. And when the Jews would force them to be circumcised, if they would stay among them, I would not permit them to have any force put upon them, but said to them, everyone ought to worship God according to his own inclinations, and not to be constrained by force, and that these men who had fled to us for protection ought not to be so treated as to repent of their coming hither. And when I had pacified the multitude, I provided for the men that were come to us whatsoever it was they wanted, according to their usual way of living, and that in great plenty also. Now King Agrippa sent an army to make themselves masters of the citadel of Gamala, and over it Equilus Modius. But the forces that were sent were not allowed to encompass the citadel quite round, but lay before it in the open places, and besieged it. But when Ebutius the Decurion, who was entrusted with the government of the great plain, heard that I was at Simonias, a village situated in the confines of Galilee, and was distant from him 60 furlongs, he took 100 horsemen that were with him by night, and a certain number of footmen, about 200, and brought the inhabitants of the city Gibeah along with him as auxiliaries, and marched in the night, and came to the village where I abode. Upon this I pitched my camp over against him, which had a great number of forces in it. But Ebutius tried to draw us down into the plain, as greatly depending upon his horsemen. But we would not come down, for when I was satisfied of the advantage that his horse would have if we came down into the plain, while we were all footmen, I resolved to join battle with the enemy where I was. Now Ebutius and his party made a courageous opposition for some time. But when he saw that his horse were useless to him in that place, he retired back to the city Gibeah, having lost 3 of his men in the fight. So I followed him directly with 2,000 armed men. And when I was at the city Bisara, that lay in the confines of Ptolemy, but 20 furlongs from Gibeah, where Ebutius abode, I placed my armed men on the outside of the village, and gave orders that they should guard the passes with great care, that the enemy might not disturb us until we should have carried off the corn, a great quantity of which lay there. It belonged to Bernice the queen, and had been gathered together out of the neighboring villages into Bisara. So I loaded my camels and asses, a great number of which I had brought along with me, and sent the corn into Galilee. When I had done this, I offered Ebutius battle. But when he would not accept of the offer, for he was terrified at our readiness and courage, I altered my route, and marched towards Neapolitanus, because I had heard that the country about Tiberias was laid waste by him. This Neapolitanus was captain of a troop of horse, and had the custody of Scythopolis entrusted to his care by the enemy. And when I had hindered him from doing any further mischief to Tiberias, I set myself to make provision for the affairs of Galilee. But when John, the son of Levi, who, as we before told you, abode at Gischala, was informed how all things had succeeded to my mind, and that I was much in favor with those that were under me, as also that the enemy were greatly afraid of me, he was not pleased with it, as thinking my prosperity tended to his ruin. So he took up a bitter envy and enmity against me, and hoping that if he could inflame those that were under me to hate me, he should put an end to the prosperity I was in, he tried to persuade the inhabitants of Tiberias and of Sepphoris. And for those of Gabara he supposed they would be also of the same mind with the others, which were the greatest cities of Galilee, to revolt from their subjection to me, and to be of his party, and told them that he would command them better than I did. As for the people of Sepphoris, who belonged to neither of us, because they had chosen to be in subjection to the Romans, they did not comply with his proposal. And for those of Tiberias, they did not indeed so far comply as to make a revolt from under me, but they agreed to be his friends, while the inhabitants of Gabara did go over to John, and it was Simon that persuaded them so to do, one who was both the principal man in the city and a particular friend and companion of John. It is true, these did not openly own the making a revolt, because they were in great fear of the Galileans, and had frequent experience of the good will they bore to me. Yet did they privately watch for a proper opportunity to lay snares for me, and indeed I thereby came into the greatest danger. On the occasion following, there were some bold young men of the village of Dabarita, who observed that the wife of Ptolemy, the king's procurator, was to make a progress over the great plain with a mighty attendance, and with some horsemen that followed as a guard to them, and this out of a country that was subject to the king and queen, into the jurisdiction of the Romans, and fell upon them on a sudden, and obliged the wife of Ptolemy to fly away, and plundered all the carriages. They also came to me to Tarakisi, with 4 mules loading of garments and other furniture, and the weight of the silver they brought was not small, and there were 500 pieces of gold also. Now I had a mind to preserve these spoils for Ptolemy, who was my countryman, and it is prohibited by our laws even to spoil our enemies. So I said to those that brought these spoils that they ought to be kept, in order to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem with them when they came to be sold. But the young men took it very ill that they did not receive a part of those spoils for themselves, as they expected to have done. So they went among the villages in the neighborhood of Tiberias, and told the people that I was going to betray their country to the Romans, and that I used deceitful language to them when I said that what had been thus gotten by rapine should be kept for the rebuilding of the walls of the city of Jerusalem, although I had resolved to restore these spoils again to their former owner. And indeed they were herein not mistaken as to my intentions, for when I had gotten clear of them, I sent for 2 of the principal men, Dashan and Jannes, the son of Levi, persons that were among the chief friends of the king, and commanded them to take the furniture that had been plundered, and to send it to him. And I threatened that I would order them to be put to death by way of punishment, if they discovered this my command to any other person. Now, when all Galilee was filled with this rumor, that their country was about to be betrayed by me to the Romans, and when all men were exasperated against me, and ready to bring me to punishment, the inhabitants of Taraki did also themselves suppose that what the young men said was true, and persuaded my guards and armed men to leave me when I was asleep, and to come presently to the hippodrome, in order there to take counsel against me their commander. And when they had prevailed with them, and they were gotten together, they found there a great company assembled already, who all joined in one clamour to bring the man who was so wicked to them as to betray them to his due punishment. And it was Jesus, the son of Saphias, who principally set them on. He was ruler in Tiberias, a wicked man, and naturally disposed to make disturbances in matters of consequence. A seditious person he was indeed, and an innovator beyond everybody else. He then took the laws of Moses into his hands, and came into the midst of the people and said, "O my fellow citizens, if you are not disposed to hate Josephus on your own account. Have regard, however, to these laws of your country, which your commander-in-chief is going to betray. Hate him, therefore, both these accounts, and bring the man who hath acted thus insolently to his deserved punishment." When he had said this, and the multitude had openly applauded him for what he had said, he took some of the armed men, and made haste away to the house in which I lodged, as if he would kill me immediately, while I was wholly insensible of all, till this disturbance happened, and by reason of the pains I had been taking, was fallen fast asleep. But Simon, who was entrusted with the care of my body, and was the only person that stayed with me, and saw the violent incursion the citizens made upon me, awaked me, and told me of the danger I was in, and desired me to let him kill me, that I might die bravely, and like a general, before my enemies came in, and forced me to kill myself, or killed me themselves. Thus did he discourse to me, but I committed the care of my life to God, and made haste to go out to the multitude. Accordingly, I put on a black garment, and hung my sword at my neck, and went by such a different way to the hippodrome, wherein I thought none of my adversaries would meet me. So I appeared among them on the sudden, and fell down flat on the earth, and bedewed the ground with my tears. Then I seemed to them all an object of compassion, and when I perceived the change that was made in the multitude, I tried to divide their opinions before the armed men should return from my house. So I granted them that I had been as wicked as they supposed me to be, but still I entreated them to let me first inform them for what use I had kept that money which arose from the plunder, and that they might then kill me if they pleased. And upon the multitudes ordering me to speak, the armed men came upon me, and when they saw me, they ran to kill me. But when the multitude bade them hold their hands, they complied, and expected that as soon as I should own to them that I kept the money for the king, it would be looked on as a confession of my treason, and they should then be allowed to kill me. When, therefore, silence was made by the whole multitude, I spake thus to them: O my countrymen, I refuse not to die, if justice so require. However, I am desirous to tell you the truth of this matter before I die. For as I know that this city of yours, Taricheae, was a city of great hospitality, and filled with abundance of such men as have left their own countries, and are come hither to be partakers of your fortune, whatever it be, I had a mind to build walls about it out of this money, for which you are so angry with me, while yet it was to be expended in building your own walls. Upon my saying this, the people of Taricheae and the strangers cried out that they gave me thanks, and desired me to be of good courage, although the Galileans and the people of Tiberias continued in their wrath against me, insomuch that there arose a tumult among them, while some threatened to kill me, and some bade me not to regard them. But when I promised them that I would build them walls at Tiberias, and at other cities that wanted them, they gave credit to what I promised, and returned every one to his own home. So I escaped the forementioned danger, beyond all my hopes, and returned to my own house, accompanied with my friends, and 20 armed men also. However, these robbers and other authors of this tumult, who were afraid, on their own account, lest I should punish them for what they had done, took 600 armed men, and came to the house where I abode, in order to set it on fire. When this their insult was told me, I thought it indecent for me to run away, and I resolved to expose myself to danger, and to act with some boldness. So I gave order to shut the doors, and went up into an upper room, and desired that they would send in some of their men to receive the money from the spoils, for I told them they would then have no occasion to be angry with me. And when they had sent in one of the boldest of them all, I had him whipped severely, and I commanded that one of his hands should be cut off, and hung about his neck. And in this case was he put out to those that sent him, at which procedure of mine they were greatly affrighted, and in no small consternation, and were afraid that they should themselves be served in like manner if they stayed there. For they supposed that I had in the house more armed men than they had themselves. So they ran away immediately, while I, by the use of this stratagem, escaped this their second treacherous design against me. But there were still some that irritated the multitude against me, and said that those great men that belong to the king ought not to be suffered to live, if they would not change their religion to the religion of those to whom they fled for safety. They spake reproachfully of them also, and said that they were wizards, and such as called in the Romans upon them. So the multitude was soon deluded by such plausible pretenses as were agreeable to their own inclinations, and were prevailed on by them. But when I was informed of this, I instructed the multitude again, that those who fled to them for refuge ought not to be persecuted. I also laughed at the allegation about witchcraft, and told them that the Romans would not maintain so many 10,000 soldiers, if they could overcome their enemies by wizards. Upon my saying this, the people assented for a while, but they returned again afterwards, as irritated by some ill people against the great men. Nay, they once made an assault upon the house in which they dwelt at Taricheae, in order to kill them, which, when I was informed of, I was afraid lest so horrid a crime should take effect, and nobody else would make that city their refuge any more. I therefore came myself, and some others with me, to the house where these great men lived, and locked the doors, and had a trench drawn from their house, leading to the lake, and sent for a ship, and embarked therein with them, and sailed to the confines of Hippos. I also paid them the value of their horses, nor in such a flight could I have their horses brought to them. I then dismissed them, and begged of them earnestly that they would courageously bear this distress which befell them. I was also myself, greatly displeased that I was compelled to expose that had fled to me to go again into an enemy's country. Yet did I think it more eligible that they should perish among the Romans, if it should so happen, than in the country that was under my jurisdiction. However, they escaped at length, and King Agrippa forgave them their offences. And this was the conclusion of what concerned these men. But as for the inhabitants of the city of Tiberias, they wrote to the king, and desired him to send them forces sufficient to be a guard to their country, for that they were desirous to come over to him. This was what they wrote to him. But when I came to them, they desired me to build their walls, as I had promised them to do, for they had heard that the walls of Taricheae were already built. I agreed to their proposal accordingly, and when I had made preparation for the entire building, I gave order to the architects to go to work. But on the third day, when I was gone to Taricheae, which was 30 furlongs distant from Tiberias, it so fell out that some Roman horsemen were discovered on their march, not far from the city, which made it to be supposed that the forces were come from the king, upon which they shouted and lifted up their voices in commendations of the king, and in reproaches against me. Hereupon one came running to me, and told me what their dispositions were, and that they had resolved to revolt from me. Upon hearing which news, I was very much alarmed, for I had already sent away my armed men from Taricheae to their own homes, because the next day was our Sabbath. For I would not have the people of Taricheae disturbed on that day by a multitude of soldiers, and indeed, whenever I sojourned at that city, I never took any particular care for a guard about my own body, because I had had frequent instances of the fidelity its inhabitants bore to me. I had now about me no more than 7 armed men, besides some friends, and was doubtful what to do. For to send to recall my own forces I did not think proper, because the present day was almost over, and had those forces been with me, I could not take up arms on the next day, because our laws forbade us so to do, even though our necessity should be very great. And if I should permit the people of Tarichus, and the strangers with them, to guard the city, I saw that they would not be sufficient for that purpose, and I perceived that I should be obliged to delay my assistance a great while. For I thought with myself that the forces that came from the king would prevent me, and that I should be driven out of the city. I considered, therefore, how to get clear of these forces by a stratagem. So I immediately placed those my friends of Tarichi, on whom I could best confide at the gates, to watch those very carefully who went out at those gates. I also called to me the heads of families, and bade every one of them to seize upon a ship, to go on board it, and to take a master with them, and follow him to the city of Tiberias. I also myself went on board one of those ships with my friends, and the 7 armed men already mentioned, and sailed for Tiberias. But now, when the people of Tiberias perceived that there were no forces come from the king, and yet saw the whole lake full of ships, they were in fear what would become of their city, and were greatly terrified, as supposing that the ships were full of men on board. So they then changed their minds, and threw down their weapons, and met me with their wives and children, and made acclamations to me with great commendations. For they imagined that I did not know their former inclinations to have been against me. So they persuaded me to spare the city. But when I was come near enough, I gave order to the masters of the ships to cast anchor a good way off the land, that the people of Tiberias might not perceive that the ships had no men on board. But I went nearer to the people in one of the ships, and rebuked them for their folly, and that they were so fickle as, without any just occasion in the world, to revolt from their fidelity to me. However, assured them that I would entirely forgive them for the time to come, if they would send 10 of the ringleaders of the multitude to me. And when they complied readily with this proposal, and sent me the men forementioned, I put them on board a ship, and sent them away to Tarichus, and ordered to be kept in prison. And by this stratagem it was that I gradually got all the senate of Tiberias into my power, and sent them to the city forementioned, with many of the principal men among the populace, and those not fewer in number than the other. But when the multitude saw into what great miseries they had brought themselves, they desired me to punish the author of this sedition. His name was Clitus, a young man, bold and rash in his undertaking. Now, since I thought it not agreeable to piety to put one of my own people to death, and yet found it necessary to punish him, I ordered Levi, one of my own guards, to go to him and cut off one of Clitus's hands. But as he that was ordered to do this was afraid to go out of the ship alone among so great a multitude, I was not willing that the timorousness of the soldier should appear to the people of Tiberias. So I called to Clitus himself, and said to him, Since thou deservest to lose both thine hands for thy ingratitude to me, be thou thine own executioner, lest if thou refusest so to be, thou undergo a worse punishment. And when he earnestly begged of me to spare him one of his hands, it was with difficulty that I granted it. So, in order to prevent the loss of both his hands, he willingly took his sword and cut off his own left hand, and this put an end to the sedition. Now the men of Tiberias, after I was gone to Tarichae, perceived what stratagem I had used against them, and they admired how I had put an end to their foolish sedition, without shedding of blood. But now, when I had sent for some of those multitudes of the people of Tiberias out of prison, among whom were Justus and his father Pistus, I made them to sup with me. And during our supper time I said to them that I knew the power of the Romans was superior to all others, but did not say so publicly because of the robbers. So I advised them to do as I did, and to wait for a proper opportunity, and not to be uneasy at my being their commander, for that they could not expect to have another who would use the like moderation that I had done. I also put Justus in mind how the Galileans had cut off his brother's hands before ever I came to Jerusalem, upon an accusation laid against him, as if he had been a rogue, and had forged some letters, as also how the people of Gamala, in a sedition they raised against the Babylonians, after the departure of Philip, slew Chairs, who was a kinsman of Philip, and withal how they had wisely punished Jesus, his brother Justus's sister's husband, with death. When I had said this to them during supper time, I in the morning ordered Justus, and all the rest that were in prison, to be loosed out of it and sent away. But before this, it happened that Philip, the son of Jasimus, went out of the citadel of Gamala upon the following occasion. When Philip had been informed that Varus was put out of his government by King Agrippa, and that Eculus Modius, a man that was of old his friend and companion, was come to succeed him, he wrote to him, and related what turns of fortune he had had, and desired him to forward the letters he sent to the king and queen. Now when Modius had received these letters, he was exceedingly glad, and sent the letters to the king and queen, who were then about Berytus. But when King Agrippa knew that the story about Philip was false, for it had been given out that the Jews had begun a war with the Romans, and that this Philip had been their commander in that war, he sent some horsemen to conduct Philip to him. And when he was come, he saluted him very obligingly, and showed him to the Roman commanders, and told them that this was the man of whom the report had gone about, as if he had revolted from the Romans. He also bid him to take some horsemen with him, and to go quickly to the citadel of Gamala, and to bring out thence all his domestics, and to restore the Babylonians to Batanea again. He also gave it him in charge to take all possible care that none of his subjects should be guilty of making any innovation. Accordingly, upon these directions from the king, he made haste to do what he was commanded. Now there was one Joseph, the son of a female physician, who excited a great many young men to join with him. He also insolently addressed himself to the principal persons at Gamala, and persuaded them to revolt from the king, and take up arms, and gave them hopes that they should, by his means, recover their liberty. And some they forced into the service, and those that would not acquiesce in what they had resolved on, they slew. They also slew Chairs, and with him Jesus, one of his kinsmen, and a brother of Justus of Tiberias. As we have already said, those of Gamala also wrote to me, desiring me to send them an armed force, and workmen to raise up the walls of their city. Nor did I reject either of their requests. The region of Gaulonitis did also revolt from the king. As far as the village Solomon told, I also built a wall about Seleucia and Sogani, which are villages naturally of very great strength. Moreover, I, in like manner, walled several villages of Upper Galilee, though they were very rocky of themselves. Their names are Jamnia, and Meroth, and Achabar. I also fortified, in the Lower Galilee, the cities Tariki, Tiberias, Sepphoris, and the villages, the cave of Arbela, Basobi, Selamin, Jotapata, Cafareco, and Sigo, and Jaffa, and Mount Tabor. I also laid up a great quantity of corn in these places, and arms withal, that might be for their security afterward. But the hatred that John, the son of Levi, bore to me grew now more violent, while he could not bear my prosperity with patience. So he proposed to himself, by all means possible, to make away with me, and built the walls of Gischala, which was the place of his nativity. He then sent his brother Simon, and Jonathan the son of Susanna, and about 100 armed men, to Jerusalem, to Simon the son of Gamaliel, in order to persuade him to induce the commonalty of Jerusalem to take from me the government over the Galileans, and to give their suffrages for conferring that authority upon him. This Simon was of the city of Jerusalem, and of a very noble family of the sect of the Pharisees, which are supposed to excel others in the accurate knowledge of the laws of their country. He was a man of great wisdom and reason, and capable of restoring public affairs by his prudence, when they were in an ill posture. He was also an old friend and companion of John. But at that time he had a difference with me. When therefore he had received such an exhortation, he persuaded the high priests, Ananus, and Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, and some others of the same seditious faction, to cut me down. Now I was growing so great, and not to overlook me while I was aggrandizing myself to the height of glory. And he said that it would be for the advantage of the Galileans, if I were deprived of my government there. Ananus also, and his friends desired them to make no delay about the matter, lest I should get the knowledge of what was doing too soon, and should come and make an assault upon the city with a great army. This was the counsel of Simon. But Artanus, the high priest, demonstrated to them that this was not an easy thing to be done, because many of the high priests and of the rulers of the people bore witness that I had acted like an excellent general, and that it was the work of ill men to accuse one against whom they had nothing to say. When Simon heard Ananus say this, he desired that the messengers would conceal the thing, and not let it come among many. For that he would take care to have Josephus removed out of Galilee very quickly. So he called for John's brother Simon, and charged him that they should send presents to Ananus and his friends. For, as he said, they might probably by that means persuade them to change their minds. And indeed Simon did at length thus compass what he aimed at. For Artanus and those with him, being corrupted by bribes, agreed to expel me out of Galilee, without making the rest of the citizens acquainted with what they were doing. Accordingly, they resolved to send men of distinction as to their families, and of distinction as to their learning also. 2 of these were of the populace, Jonathan and Ananias, by sect Pharisees, while the third, Josa, was of the stock of the priests, and a Pharisee also. And Simon, the last of them, was of the youngest of the high priests. These had it given them in charge, that, when they were come to the multitude of the Galileans, they should ask them what was the reason of their love to me, and if they said that it was because I was born at Jerusalem, that they should reply that they 4 were all born at the same place. And if they should say it was because I was well versed in their law, they should reply that neither were they unacquainted with the practices of their country. But if, besides these, they should say, they loved me because I was a priest, they should reply that 2 of these were priests also,